Hello, we are Team 3, and let me introduce you to this number 9 million. 9 million is a very high number, isn't it? Let's see a smaller number 800. What do these numbers mean? 9 million US small businesses in risk of closing forever. 800 small businesses are closed per day. For our research, we would be researching about two industries that have been affected the most by the pandemic, which are car dealerships and small and family owned restaurants. I will now be passing it on to Julia to further explain about the car dealership industry.
Thank you, Joey. Let's discuss car dealerships. So, first, we're going to talk about the negative effects of the pandemic on car dealerships. Throughout the pandemic, the majority of consumers have become cost conscious. Given that this is such an unprecedented time, people aren't looking to spend unnecessary amounts of money. This really hurt the car dealership industry as cars are, as you know, a more expensive transaction. In addition, there were various manufacturing complications that slowed down the supply chain. In fact, dealer stocks have been running about 25% thinner than normal. Some car manufacturers were forced to shut down their factories during the initial outbreak due to the slowdown of international trade and supply chains being disrupted. Not only this, but there was a chip maker shortage that severely slowed down the production of automobiles across the world. These issues led to the overall shortage of vehicles at car dealerships nationwide. Now, on to the positive effects. So, first, as you know, in general, people were less trusting of public transportation. And so, because of the pandemic, people who lived in cities and did not have cars were now moving to the suburbs and in need of a vehicle. So, that increased sales a little bit. Similarly, those who relied on public transportation and ride sharing were now looking to own their own vehicle to avoid possible exposure to COVID-19. And second, less stock ended up helping these car dealerships because car companies have been giving priority to their most popular models and feature combinations, which has reduced complexity and cut supply chain costs, therefore increasing profit for these car dealerships. Now we're going to talk about some of the methods these dealerships used to adapt to the pandemic. And the first and the most obvious, as we've seen across all businesses, is the transition to online sales. A lot of car sales are now moving to online platforms, and the cars are being sold and delivered to consumers right at their homes. And the second one, which we discussed already, was keeping a smaller car stock because in the end, they learned that this helped lift profits. And if it weren't for the pandemic and these unexpected factory closures, it's simple to say that the car dealerships would have never realized that there were so many benefits to keeping less cars in stock. Now I'm going to pass it on to Oliver.
Thank you, Julia. Now we're going to get on to the small and family-owned restaurant industry. Some of the negative effects of the pandemic on the small and family-owned restaurant industry have been closures and job losses, rent deferral, and consumer frugality. The most obvious and threatening effect of the pandemic on these small family-owned restaurants was the closure of the restaurants that resulted in job losses for both the owners as well as all those that the owners employed. While larger chain restaurants may have had more capital to help withstand the hardship over the past year, many family small-owned restaurants did not and were first forced to close. Some restaurants who rent their spaces had been given extra time to pay rent by their landlords as well, although the deferred payments must eventually be made. While this relieved some of the immediate financial pressure some of the restaurants faced, it still creates a large outstanding balance that they have to face after the pandemic is over and when business resumes as it did prior. Some may argue that this delayed burden may place the restaurants under even worse pressure when the time comes for them to settle their rent deferrals. With the economic halt that the pandemic introduced, there also came a halt in consumer spending across the world in the restaurant industry. With limited savings and little to no recurring income during the months of quarantine and lockdown, consumers became much more frugal and avoided extra expenditures, one of which being ordering food from restaurants. Instead, many people preferred the alternative of cooking at home because it saved money, and because of that, restaurants generated a lot less revenue. Despite some of the negative effects that came from the pandemic, there were also a few positive effects that were seen in the restaurant industry. Two of these effects were the emergence of new forms of restaurants and less waste committed by restaurants. In response to closures, some restaurants adopted ghost kitchen models, which allowed them to mitigate much of their costs and only worry about maintaining kitchen operations. A ghost kitchen, which is also sometimes called a colony kitchen, is a single restaurant or a group of meal preparation kitchens at one storefront without any traditional restaurant amenities. This restaurant model is one that introduces various unforeseen benefits. It reduces costs, restaurants are able to collaborate in different ways, and collectively contribute to the cost of their location and even advertise as having a variety of dining options to attract more customers. Moreover, the overall dining experience for consumers has changed drastically following restaurant closures. Restaurants are now more efficient in conserving food, water, and condiments, as they're only served upon request as opposed to automatically. While this is a very small part of the dining experience, on a larger scale, it has been seen to be much more efficient and conscious on the part of the restaurants, as it saves them money and avoids extra wastage. With the suspension of dine-in eating for the greater part of 2020, restaurants lost virtually all of their revenue stream and had to resort to relying on government's payroll protection program. The family-owned restaurants, as well as larger ones, had to apply for PPP loans in order to keep their businesses afloat while only making a fraction of normal revenue numbers. These loans are forgivable sums of money awarded by state and federal governments to cover costs of their payrolls for a given period of time. In addition, restaurants were certainly mandated to keep both their staff and customers safe once reopening through the implementation of various sanitation and protective measures. Menus were digitized via QR codes. Employees were given special forms of PPP, which many people have seen in the example of face shields, to help keep themselves protected from patrons. And patrons only received extra things like salt, pepper, and different condiments in disposable packaging, as opposed to using reusable shakers or containers. And now I'm going to pass it on to Kim to discuss some of the recommendations we have for these two industries.
Because of the COVID-19 pandemic has drastically changed these organizations, we would recommend the Lewin change model, which is a 3-step process of change, which involve unfreezing, changing, and refreezing. Unfreezing is a step that dictates the source of the change, or in this case, for both organizations, it is the COVID-19 pandemic. It is an external force of change since it occurs outside of the organization. The changing step for a car dealership would be to utilize Zoom and other online services to sell their cars. Currently, there's a website like Car Gurus, but it doesn't allow the consumer to buy directly from the dealership, because they can do financing on a site, but then they still need to physically go into the dealer to buy the cars. And for small and family-owned restaurants, they could implement COVID-19 specials, which are specials that either give a discount when the customer takes takeout, or maybe even special meals if you have your vaccination cards, and subscription services. This is so that they can provide the restaurant with extra revenue to help pay their bills, because a lot of restaurants are closing down right now because of the lockdown. And the third step, refreezing. For refreezing, this step is what management can do to enforce the change. For car dealerships, management can introduce new technology to the dealers, such as letting them use Zoom and letting them practice before interacting with the customers to ensure a smooth transition. And for small and family-owned restaurants, management can add COVID-19 specials to the menu and subscription services also on the menu. And all of these recommendations, they are short-term solutions because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but they can be implemented as long-term solutions, because even after the pandemic, people would still be uncomfortable showing up to these places simply because of the fear of getting COVID. Another recommendation would be to utilize the 5 tips for effective change. So the first tip would be to set realistic change goals. This, for example, for car dealerships, the managers can ease the dealers in by letting them use Zoom first, and then later allowing them to utilize other aspects of our current technology to help them sell cars. The second step would be to ensure senior leaders' involvement and commitment. An example for the car dealership would be when a dealer is talking with a customer via Zoom, a manager can be there and he or she can be involved in either the customer service or even to resolve technical issues. The third will be to walk the talk. This, for example, for the car dealerships, the managers can set up mock interviews or mock examples so that both the managers and the dealers can know that both of them can utilize this new technology. The fourth step would be to be clear on why. For restaurant managers, they can explain to their employees why they are implementing these COVID-19 specials or why they're implementing the subscription services, because so that there will not be any confusion. And fifth, it would be to align performance management practices. This is so that they can provide incentives. For example, the managers of the restaurant can provide a commission fee for the workers that manage to get a customer to sign up to the subscription services that the restaurant has. Now I will be passing it on to Devin to conclude our presentation.
Thank you, Kim. A limitation of our research and recommendations is that it is using past information to predict future events in a pandemic, which can be very unpredictable. There might be a sudden change, like a lockdown that forces all businesses to close, making our recommendations obsolete. The pandemic caused by coronavirus has affected all aspects of life and has been detrimental to organizations, especially in the city of Los Angeles. With the largest population in California, a state with massive amounts of cases, organizations here were forced to close, to choose between closing or staying open and adapting. Many organizations were forced to close, but lots of information can be gathered from the innovations that organizations made to keep their doors open. Car dealerships and restaurants both rely heavily on in-person environments, something the pandemic did not allow. These organizations were affected greatly by COVID-19, and understanding how they managed to stay in business is crucial. Thank you for listening to our presentation. Now, if you guys have any questions, you can ask them now.